Hi everyone, am I audible? Halo? Udah? Oke. Oh wait. Okay. Judges, as the government side of the house, we propose the idea of sport teams should be owned by the local government instead of privately owned. Why? This is the urgencies. First, exploitation. The privately owned company will only care about the sake of profit, the sake and profit of their own company. There is no guarantee that after the privately owned company own the sport teams, there's no guarantee that they will consider the fact and the sake of the local community, and they can just ignore the sake of the local area or make it as the second priorities. Second, transparency. Privately owned company can be not transparent with the local area or local community because, as I've mentioned before, they will more likely only care about profit or don't care enough about the sport team's local community. We all know that sport they need we all know that sport need a lot of budget to support that team, right? So there is a likelihood that the privately owned company will only care about profit and not the local community. And efficiency. If the privately owned company try to care about the local community, they only invite the local when they feel that they need to discuss it with the local. And if the sport teams is owned by local government, it will be more efficient since they can take a decision immediately and the decision that are needed by the teams and by the local government. And we are not talking about privately sport teams such as runs football teams or etc. We are talking about the local teams such as Persiraja that in Jakarta or Persija that a football team from Jakarta or Persiraja that a local football team from Aceh and other local sport teams. Besides, privately company can only care about the profit, which can lead to first, ignore the real potential of the area. They can just recruit a person to be on that team. Meanwhile, there is another person that more capable or is putera daerah just because they want to or just because that person is what their investor wanted to. And then the sport team is not purely for the sport championship purposes, not to hold the competing and uphold sportsmanship. They can be a tool to the private company to make more and more and more profit. Let's see how that local team but owned by private company affect to the local community. Sport teams is one of their assets. They doesn't just need exposure if the team won because maybe they had more resources from the private-owned company. And the local community will lose the sense of loving their sport team, lose the sense of loving their own assets in their local area just because there is no sense of belonging to the team. And as I've mentioned before, if they're owned by the private owned company, there is no communication between the teams and the local area, and it will lead to the local area losing sense of belonging the team. Example, Persiraja. We as Acehnese love the Persiraja and we want to support Persiraja, but if Persiraja owned by a private company, we will there is no transparency. We will have no right to tell that team how they can improve and etc. And we will lose the sense of belonging to the team. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Am I audible? I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, we think this debate is not really clarified enough and is not being really clear at the benches of government side of the house, right? Why we said so? Once the moment you actually see the motions, you need to clarify the certain kind of things, right? Why we said so? Because you need to understand the things that we're going to debate is whether or not the government interventions will going to be exist necessarily in this kind of debate, right? They never mentions to you how the government will going to be intervened in this kind of debate, right? They never told to you how they're going to be developed where much more, right? While there is a lot of questions here beside in their kind of the house, right? Why we said so? Because there's not much characterizations and mechanism on how they're going to proceed the end of their goal, for example, right, in this kind of debate. On the moment they said that it's going to be effective, right, under the side of the house, right? But it's going to be like it's good to be true, right? When on the moment they're going to say, right, oh, it's going to be immediately fine, for example, they're going to provide anything by the government, for example. But notice that the government has a lot of something to be prioritized at the moment, right? They have like more things to be considered at the end of the day, right? And notice that bureaucracy is complex to actually getting fund, for example, right? When on the moment they said that is we're going to lose feel of local community, for example, because the private sector will be going to take the identity, for example. We say this no, for example. Even if private sector actually take the management of this kind of thing, for example, it's going to be okay, right? Why we say so? Because, for example, Manchester United, for example, is they're still coming from United Kingdom, for example. There's the identity, right? That's where they're coming from, for example. That's what they actually symbolize, for example, at the end of the day, right? So the things that you need to understand and notice in the very first place, that the government saw the potential to use sport industry as their political tools, right? However, government failed to actually fulfill its role to actually develop the sport industry due to overlapping interests between government and the sport industry at the end of the day, right? Well, it is actually important to be addressed at the very first place, right? This proposal, if it's going to be applied, for example, if it will going to be paralyzed the development of sport industry. Why we said so? Because government on the moment they own industry, that is usually serving and prioritizing government interests at the very first place, right? Meanwhile, this overlapping interest will actually neglect the development of sport teams, right? Due to the limit funding, for instance, given by government, for example, and the restriction of the private investor to take place, while there's kind of most likely to happen, right? First, the limit, and then the limitations of funding will lead to the salary cap, because government-owned industry, for example, they're going to be follow government salary rules, which will not fair to sport players. Sport players will actually considering players are paid based on their performance, right? And could not be generalized to every single kind of player itself, right? Second, there will be some of government-related rule that is more restricted to the sport team's flexibility to hire player, right? Due to the use of national asset, for example, it won't be flexible as a private-owned sport teams, right? At the end of the day, even if the private sector contributing much or even on this sport team, government will still get their national branding and exposure, right? They still got their national interest by not paralyzing sport team development due to lack of funding, for example. How are we going to make giving the mechanism in this kind of debate, right? We need to give access to private investor, for example, to contribute towards sport industry, for example. Second, government could still provide subsidy, for example, but it will not rely on this kind of funding, right? Third, even if the sport team at the end of the day would fully owned by the private sector, the government still have their law, for example, to control the sport team actually, and the team will still comply to this term and condition provided by the government, right? Which will not disrupt the team development and still like benefit the government at the end of the day, right? Harm is the things that is going to be harm, right? Because it's going to be controlled by the politics, be going to be giving like the whole things right to the government, for example. Because the moment you're talking about the sport, for example, and the things that the funding coming from government, for example, it very depends on the political conditions, right? The political interest that actually being aware in the status quo, right? For example, on the moment you realize there is cancellation of U20 World Cup, for example, it is just because we have certain kind of political issue, right? Towards the certain country, for example, in terms of what is that? Develop a certain event, for example, the funding given by government is also limited, and government has certain kind of the things that actually going to be provided, right? At the end of the day, by this kind of problem, something that is problematic, right? Their incentive by the incentive for the sport player is going to be very limited, and it's going to be very uncertain, right? While those funding they have to keep playing, for example, for their life, for example. So comparatively, when you're actually giving this towards the private sector, for example, right? They're more likely to actually giving much more priorities with this, right? They're going to be more focused with this, right? At the end, when they're going to prioritize this, they're going to be much benefit and so much more, right? Because they actually having like more funding, for example. They actually at the end they could provide a better player, for example. They're actually going to buy a better player for this kind of team, for example. They're going to have better facilities, better coach, for example, right? That's the things that are going to be in charge the performance from this kind of team development, right? That's why we say that it's going to be more beneficial under our setup the house in terms of team development, for example, right? Coming to the analysis of best and worst case scenario that most likely to happen under both sides, for example. On the moment we said that is the best case scenario that most likely to happen under our side, we said it's going to be more beneficial, right? In terms of the team development and performance, right? Because private sector will going to be prioritized more, for example, there is more funding, right? At the end of the day, there is more like better performance, right? Because they're going to have better facilitation, for example. Comparatively, if you really rely on the government funding, for example, it's not going to be effective because there's much more political interest at the end of the day, right? And the worst case scenario, the more likely to happen, right? Even if the government team side of the house will going to say, oh, it is going to be monetize them, for example, it is going to be push them so hard, for example, because at the moment it is going to have much more pressure towards the player, for example, right? We say it is going to be fine, for example. The things that is going to be developed, right? We say it is okay, right? Because the thing is unlikely, even if there is pressure, there is the things that is good to actually enhance their performance, right? Enhance their skill, for example, right? And it is okay, right? Because at least there is good facilities, there is good coach, for example, there is good player at the team, for example. That's what we want in this kind of debate, rather than like actually relate towards this kind of government funding, for example, at the end of the day, right? If we're going to take the control, it's going to be harmful at the end of the day, right? By saying this motions, we beg to oppose.
Three things that we want to talk about. First, why the teams is important to the local area. Second, why the owning by local is better, and lastly, why it's harm by owning to privately make the teams privately. First, before that, let me respond to the OO. One, because there is it's just about we have to know that how the fundings and investments still happens in our side of the house, because one, there's a negotiation. So if the teams is still owning by the local area, we can do the negotiations or such as a benefits offer to the investor, for example, branding and sponsor and etc. So it's not necessary at all to be owning that all the teams. It's just we have to make very efficient and very efficient corporations toward the investor at all. So it's not only the teams that to buy of these teams which is not efficient any at all, and decisions will take on the teams itself. So if you can see that the only thing that we have to know, if the teams is owning by the privately, it will all of the decision on the teams will be made by that people or who's the owners, right? So it's very humbly to the government that I will say in my point letter. Even if the regulation is, we have to know about the regulations. They chat about the regulations at all, but we have to know that the regulation is just control the basic things to the sports. For example, that if you're owning this kind of teams, you have to pay the tax or etc. etc. But you have to know that the sport, to make sport is more productive is much complex than just a basic regulation that offered by government. So under the government regulation is not solve this kind of problem. So we have to know that owning by people area is much better in our case. So why the teams is important to the local area? We have to know the team is important to the local area that because that teams in the local area is represent that area, right? It's represent the area when they competing, right? So the burden of this kind of thing when they competing, it will happen to that owner itself. So for example, if you as the owner of Persiraja and you are the local area of Jakarta, for example, you have the burden of all of such thing or the burden from the community to push you to make your team is much better rather than if I from Aceh being owner by Persiraja, so there is no burden for me to make the teams is much better. It's just the sense of money, alright? And local area could check whether there is anything wrong with management or towards player that could harm the teams, right? We can see that if the Persija itself is not make their performance much better, the local area could check or even approach me as that people in the local area because the owner is local area. So it's much better and easier to the local area to do a check and balance in this kind of things to increase the productivity of that team itself, right? And the more develop the teams, the hype change to local area develop. Because of what? Because one, it's open to job opportunity. As the local area that owning the local teams, you will open more jobs opportunity to your friend or to your family or to your people in that area, right? Because your area is prioritizing in this kind of the things. But if it's owning by privately, the owner maybe will not think about this kind of the things or even take the benefit to himself, right? Second, branding, it will increase the branding to the area itself because as your local area, you will make the teams when you increase the productivity of the teams, it will branding to your area itself. It will lead to the pushing that when the local area pushing you, right? 3, more checks and balance will happen in that area first. So it's much better to local area in that team to owning the teams, right? Second, why the owner by local area is better? Because like I was saying, there is a sense of belongings there is a sense of belongings and why it is happen. Characteristic, because one, it's about the pride of the same area. You want as that area, you want your team is much better than other teams, right? Because you have a sense of belonging. For example, if I from Jakarta, I want my Persija is much better than other area, right? Because there is a pride from you to be the best performance in your team. You want to increase your productivity of your team at all costs, right? This is the pushing from yourself, from your ego or selfishness of the humans that want your team is much better than others, right? Because of this, it will make your teams is increase the productivity at the end of the day. Second, because it's about the pressure toward people that I already told about you, it will make or the people or the local area in your area will set the expectation towards your teams, and there will be more balance in your team at the end of the day. And there is So there will be two things that you make. First, you will make sure that your team have a best performance and management at the end of the day, because there is a sense of pride and there is a push towards the local area. And secondly, you will be open more to the opportunity to that local area because you are owning that area. And when your team is successful in your area or in competition, you will more open the opportunity because the local area itself is set the high expectation for yourself, right? Why is harm? And lastly, why is harm to owning privately? Two things. It's just about business, right? For example, we can see that when Eric Thohir owning the Inter Milan, there is no pressure, right, for Eric Thohir to make the best priority or make best the management to Inter Milan itself, because there is no pressure from the local area in Milan, for example, to Eric Thohir, because the Eric Thohir itself is Indonesian, right? So there is no expectation at all for that kind of things, that they just want to make Inter Milan safe as the teams or even survive that kind of the thing. So it will not increase the productivity at all. So it's only used as investment matter, and at the end of the day, it not increase the sport competitions at the end, right? It leads to one, decreasing the performance. Why it will decreasing the performance of the sport? Because management change easily cause the sake of all the owners, right? When the Eric Thohir, for example, Eric Thohir owning Inter Milan, he will change that because he like this kind of management, or he like the special management that approach him, for example, and etc. Without double checking that if that the best management that they can have, or example. And secondly, player can change easily cause the sake of the owner too, right? Because if you as the owner, you want to, for example, Cristiano Ronaldo to come to your teams, and you, because of the pride or example that you can still bring that Cristiano Ronaldo, even if you know that Cristiano Ronaldo couldn't change anything to your teams, right? So the worst case, how it's easily, the worst case that it will happen, it will decreasing the performance of the team itself, and there is no change for the sport team, and it's just at the end of the day the stuff that you're buying or the stuff that you want to branding, because it will make the money for the owner itself. There is no more sense of belonging to the local area. There is more development to the local area itself, because at the end of the day, these teams is represent the local area. So there is no transparency and check and balance, and it's only property, no pressure from local area, and at the end, the team itself will just be a staff and no more. Thank you.
Am I audible enough? All right. Panels, before I come into my argument, I would like to rebut a couple statements that has been mentioned by the opening government. First, they keep talking about these individuals only care about profit, but government at the end of the day would utilize this sport industry for profit. They invest money not just for fun, they also expect the revenue and good performance of the group. Secondly, compared to the private-owned sport teams who has better funding, better accommodation, with the same burden, which is making profit and showing good performance, the trade-off that the government bench is offering is not fair and harming the sport industry, who has utilized the limited amount of money given by the government and still ask them to push these sport teams for a very good performance with lack of facility. Therefore, we believe that our argument still stands. Secondly, they talk about efficient cooperation, which means that it should be fair, considering the private sector contribute more towards the share of sport industry. National-owned company or organization or teams, which means that at least the government should own 51% of the share. But in reality, the government bench failed to mechanize how could Indonesian government support the funding towards every single regional sport team within the nation. There are so many of them, and there is no way that they could fund everything by 51%. And then even if the government agreed to fund these regional teams, the funding given could not be exactly 51% of the share to all regional teams, unless the government want to neglect their other duty and priorities, such as allocating educational fund just to fulfill this sport funding. And then third, I would like to refer the things about sense of belonging. We're talking about the funding mechanism. Just because these regional sport teams owned by private or individual, it doesn't mean that the sense of belonging is absent at the first place. Persija or Persibaya could still belong to Jakarta or Surabaya because their name still stands. It's just the matter of the fundings. They're not going to change the name into Nabila football teams, for example. No, because we're talking about the investment right here. By making this characterization to make all the regional sport teams belong to the government, which means that almost all the asset contributing into these sport teams would be owned by the government, it just feels so surreal. So we believe that this sense of belonging would not absent even if the private or individual people own this club, because it represents still the local area. We only talk about the funding here. And then fourth, they say that there is no pressure if it is private owned. This is clearly wrong. Private or individual seek profit, and by all means, good performance and good management is the focal concern of this individual to actually profit from this industry. Rather than the government, who has many priorities, many duties, they could not just focus on the development of sport industry. That's why we believe that there is no necessity to restrict the private or individual appearance in terms of contributing towards the funding or even owning this regional football team or sport teams, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, I would like to convey why the private investor should be allowed. First, private investor contribute much more because their focus is to develop this team for profit purposes. More fundings, better accommodation, and a larger investment. More chance would be given towards this regional team to develop because they have more capital, because it's owned by private sector. For example, the Manchester United teams, the regional team somewhere in Europe, are owned by a very wealthy man from Qatar. Because they are owned by this individual, they could buy Cristiano Ronaldo and let him perform to the Manchester United itself, which means that it could increase the performance of the regional club itself without even hurting its identity at the first place. Just because now it is owned by someone from Qatar, it doesn't mean that it's going to change the identity of Manchester United. That is exactly what we're talking about. We are not talking about turning them into something new. We are just talking about who should own this. Just because the government... Yes?
Since the both entity and owners are in different nationality, how do you enforce accountability? Who does the audit and who does get punished should there any foul play involved in the club?
Therefore, in our country, there is in the current status quo, we have taxes, we have the established law regarding how they should invest and how they should perform this own corporation or own team, and it doesn't bother the national government itself, because how many companies are owned by private sector in our area? Is all company like Unilever and many things else are owned by Indonesia? No. Does they harm our community? No. It will work the same, just like how it's gonna be in the sport teams. So just because they are owned by the other nationality or private individual, it doesn't mean that it's gonna hurt the national identity. Because first thing first, just like what I told you, the sense of belonging doesn't rely on the funding mechanism. The sense of belonging relies on the character of the teams itself. Just because now the new funding are from Qatar, for example, it doesn't mean that Persija is gonna be Persi Qatar, right? So it's still gonna be Persija. So now come to our mechanism, just like what has been mentioned by the leader of opposition. We would like to address this by giving more access towards the private sector to contribute for our sport industry. Government could still provide subsidy, but we will not only rely on this kind of fundings, because we believe that government still has priorities, and we would not only rely on this towards the development of the sport industry. So therefore, that's why this is solely the strongest base why we should allow these individuals to contribute or even own these sport teams at the first place. Even if the sport team at the end of the day would fully owned by the private sector, the government still have the check and balance. They still have their laws and everything. So if they think that there is something wrong with the football or the sport team, they would easily audit the team, because the law still stands. They are in Indonesia, they are in this nation. They do not have any other options but comply to the current law of Indonesia. So therefore, by all means, we strongly oppose the motion, because we believe that individual shares or individuals investment would much better benefit, give better benefit towards the sport team itself. And we need to understand that the sport team is not only political tools. We have seen what the government do towards the U20 competition that get cancelled just because they have some kind of beef with other nations. We do not want it to happen. So therefore, we strongly oppose this to be owned by the government sector. Thank you.
I understand the concern from the opposition regarding funding and the degree of priority when owning a sports club. But here's a good thing. Okay, sorry. I think I'm getting close. Check. Okay, sorry. Start over. Okay. I see the opposition's concern regarding how limited funding can be obtained from government and how degree of prioritization prevents them from owning a sports club. But here's a good thing about being a government. They can offer you something other than money. For example, while they are taking over an existing sports club for majority shares, you can offer them other than money, such as tax holidays. Well, because most of sports club owners have another business entity, and you can trade their other business entity as their leverage to basically take over their sports club without spending a dime, which is good. And being a government also allows you to control all the policies that occur within the club itself. And you need to understand that while taking over the majority shares, it doesn't need to happen all at once. It can take place gradually, year after year. After all, states are provided funds from their own PAD, pendapatan asli daerah, and also special allocation budget from central government. So their budget are refreshed every year, and it can take place gradually, putting less burden to their financial power. As long as there are regulation sets in place, such as governor can set an executive order, well, to ensure that such a buyout scheme can transcend his political terms. And while the opposition also said that private sector owning a sports club can provide better player, better coach, this might be true, but that creates another problem. The thing is, local players, local coach, local talents get sidelines when it comes to local sports team owned by foreign entities. By shifting the majority controlling stakes from private sector to government, we will ensure, and they can ensure, that local talents are prioritized for our coach and players, which is a good thing because they can also act as a proxy to central government while they are searching for potential players to be inserted into the national team. So in this case, both central government interests and local government are more aligned than those of with private sectors. And Since what I propose the scheme is using little to no money, the money they do have can be spent on better infrastructure, better players, and they can just hire a capable management who are used in conducting operation in sports club, so they don't need to bother and they can prioritize with their day-to-day operations, which have much more pressing matter. And the bad thing about private sector owning a sports club is that they not only they prioritize profits, but they also only, as you wish.
Okay, you keep talking about the gradual transition, but in your mechanism, it doesn't say how long will it take and how could you guarantee the sport industry development not be paralyzed during the process? Thank you.
Since the buyout process takes gradually, I have mentioned earlier that there will be gubernatorial executive order to ensure that such schemes would happen even the policymakers do not get re-elected. And after all, while the buyout process still occurs, there are still majority owners that are in place, which is the previous owners. So the day-to-day operations of the basis of the operation of the club will not be interrupted. For example, the 10-year of the acquisition, government still have 46%, and the last year they have 51%. So only the shift to the majority stakes only take place a while. So it won't disrupt any day-to-day operations of a sports club. And back to my another argument that this, okay, you may say that social pride still exists even when private sector owns the club. But here's the thing, when local government, let alone their own government, owns the sports club, it will further increase their social pride and cohesion among fans, prompting them to go to the stadium, watch the match, and increasing more profits. Furthermore, these profits will ensure get returned to the government, the local government, and the publics inside, instead of going to the single conglomerate, let alone foreign entity, out of our own soil. And this policy of taking over sports club could also make local sports team to a bigger stage, to nationwide stage. Because at the end of the day, as much power conglomerate has, they are not the government itself. They can make the regulation themselves. Another one? So be it.
We do not see how the fans care so much about who owns the team. As long as it's still Persija or Persibaya, nothing would be different. Thank you.
It may not be much, but there are increase in interest. And there, let me tell you, and that's not even the most best thing. And since I have told you that most sports team only takes care about those who already profited, it creates bigger discrepancy between large teams and mediocre or even kermit ones. So with this policy, we level out the playing field. We level out the competition itself because government, each and every one of them, has less discrepancy among budget compared to private sectors. Although there are still actually discrepancy, but not as much. And also, I like to point out that because not all sport teams are profitable, it also creates discrepancy in a way that further more players get sidelined from their own teams. And having foreign entities or private sectors owning a football team makes law enforcement much harder because at the end of the day, for MU, they have pointed out the current owner is in Qatar, the previous owner, Gulaver family, is in America, and the club is in England. Who gets to pay the price when there is a foul play? And the owners itself can protect under the law loopholes itself. And so much for asking Interpol to enforce this. I think this is a far-fetched solution for the opposition to point it out. And I'd like to also say that because of the schemes I have pointed out that the government can offer buyout with or without any money, and they have better policy, I believe that this policy is better in a way that has no risk. Thank you.
For for gender pronouns, just refer me as the speaker. Oh. How about now? Hello? How about now? Okay. For pronouns, just refer me as the position of my speaker position, and starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. CG brought you in this debate of how private-owned companies have different systems because they have stakeholders, and once these companies fail, their league is going to be bought by other companies, and then they're going to have degradation of quality of football teams and whatsoever. We think that the quality of every league or every team that is in the sports is actually depending on the players itself and within the interest of the players itself, right? Of how like one community of football players actually gathered together in order to improve the name of that league, not by how local government is forcing some random people to play football just because they think that their area isn't developed. This is what this is what government keeps bringing into the debate. They say of how private owned. They said about government they're going to give burden to these local areas to improve their sport players to increase productivity. We think that government is still forcing people to push them so hardly to sports that sport is actually their only commodity to develop in that areas, right? This harms the local areas of how they're living in under traditional values, or they choose not to do sports, then suddenly they are forced to. We think that local government is going to change regions who's famous for their, like for example, tourist destinations suddenly turned into some area that strives to play sport and not maximizing the essence of the potential of that area itself, right? What is the context for our for CO here? First of all, we think that the name of the team will actually credit the local government, like Persija whatsoever. This is likely to signalizing the government legitimacy and contribution for the team's contribution. Second is that recruitment will be limited based on the identity, based on the area and exclusivity. And why is it likely? Because like this is how the local society demands of taxation and to house back then. And what is the distinction that O is going to bring to you in this debate? First of all, CO is going to bring you in this debate. OO brought you about mechanism of how private companies have resources and capability for the quality of sports. But what we want to distinct in this debate is why identity of locals shouldn't be brought in a sport context. First of all, we think that sports shouldn't be correlate with such identities because first of all, we say that you can see how football teams are radical in the status quo right now, right? Because we can see of how football in West Java and East Java made a commotion and riots of how one of these teams lose to one another, and then they keep judging to each other and create competitiveness between identity itself and not how like they want to fight against one individual players to another player. So their main framing here is that I want to defeat East Java and I want to defeat West Java rather than to how addressing of how the players itself. And second of all, why we think that sport isn't going to be enjoyable in government bench. First of all, we think that a government have too many political agendas, especially in regards of economy, inequality, management and bureaucracy, while they're already having gave the autonomy upon each local government to execute this. Therefore, like first, development of sport will politically be incentivized. That is first, it is the different local government that have different priority, while at the same time they compete competitively. Or second, the same time which the second scenario as funding the same between local government people, because people are unlikely to join sport teams because of unwillingness to support the sport, and therefore their growth is very limited, but also how they can get insignificant benefit, especially in regards to wages, facilities, and etc. Right? And Why is this important? Because sport is a competitive game for you to enjoy. You want to enjoy sports, which the benefit then is likely going to be happening in opposition. Comparatively in CO, first of all, as it's privately owned, they're going to invest enormously as they're optimistic about this promotion to how they're going to get the economic benefit, because like competitive and talented players are about to be rewarded proportionally to their performance, which incentivizes them to be better players, to profit and to give profits to these companies, right? This also means that CO will invite many newcomers, as how football isn't limited to nationalism, but also how to be an athlete that pays for your life. And this argument is important because of how why private owned is actually going to give meritocracy in selections of football itself, right? Because we think that when you have meritocracy in this kind of system, we think that we're going to be able to get better teams and better people to actually contribute to maximizing the profit of the company itself, like how when talented and most beneficial players are going to join the team, it is most likely for private owned to select these teams fairly from their skills purely, right, from the selection. And that is why private companies have no intention of racism and whatsoever, because what they want is profit at the end of the day, right? And how private owned teams are actually most likely to increase fame for these identities itself, because in private owned companies, you're actually trying to maximize the potential of these individuals from the very first place, right? Like you give room for these individuals that come from marginalized areas that never actually have football or even interested in football at the very first place. You give room for them to develop as they want to be the best player that can actually represent their region as a whole. Because like fame can still happen in our side, as how like these players will actually join these prestigious leagues, and if they manage to get in, then they're going to get the fame of how they're purely talented, right? It's not because of how they come from East Java, and then after that they're going to be famous from football and stuff. It's because of their pure skills, and that is what we want to achieve in opposition, of how like we don't force regions to actually focus more on football, but rather to actually focusing on their own interests and how we can actually increase football players at the end of the day. And therefore, we're so proud to oppose.
Am I audible? Okay, I'm just gonna wait. You can raise your hand, or yeah, you can raise your hand or shout POI if you want to POI. Okay, so a few rebuttals for the opposition side. Your side previously mentions that you need to remember that when the local government, the 100% policy control is within the government itself, and this ensures the accountability in the government, because this does not mean with the 100% local government involvement, this is actually better for the nation. That will be further explained later on. Now, the investors could be varied, right? With the majority of the investors are still the local side, and the 49% of the investors are private investors. Now, this opens new opportunities and many parties to be involved in that local government. So it's not just the local government itself funding the team, and this actually opens doors to the people and to people outside if the team is actually profitable and highly valued by other teams. Now, why is this local government is better accountability compared to private investors? Investors reach on profit, like that's their main goal. Instead, in the local government side, they have their activities are being watched and supervised by organizations like BPK. So abuse or assault is minimized in that sense. Now, coming up to an extension from my previous speaker. Now, why should the government place a higher emphasis investing on the local sports team? Why? Because diehard fans, and we all know that the sports industry have a very large audience, right? And unfortunately, Indonesia has not exploited this fact. We all know that these fans are rapidly growing, and for example of this is like the most followed person on Instagram is Cristiano Ronaldo, right? This means that the occupation of the sports itself has a huge audience, it has potential to grow, but Indonesia just has not explored that fact yet. Now, in the status quo of countries like Indonesia, these sports talents are underappreciated and disregarded compared to other sectors in Indonesia, like business or tech, where their talents in countries like Indonesia, where their talents, if the person is actually good at football, they are forced to transition to other businesses because in their mindset, they will create a better profit, but that's not actually the case. Now, the opposition side also concerns about the human development that the nation hindered. There may be lower budgets to go to the coaches and to go to the trainings, so it will obviously contribute to how the quality of the player themselves within that local government. Now, we need to remember that local talent search opens to all doors of Indonesia, and the local government's priority is to nurture the talents instead to simply invest. When this nurturing is successful, right, the government, you need to realize that the government has a higher budget than any investor itself. The government does not need profit in order to sustain itself because this is the government. Their main priority is not only to profit, but to nurture the talents of that nation. And in investing, we already explained before that in private groups, they only look at the merits and their track records. This is actually bad. Why? Because, for example, in the UK, Manchester United's talents came from scattered multiple nationalities, and they don't care, and they don't contribute to the UK directly. As at least, if you were to argue from taxes and things like that, it's not as much as the majority of stake, which is 51%, which holds a high value compared to just being a private investor. Now, this means that in the UK, the MU talents are being scattered in multiple nationalities. This means that their talents, this can actually strip away the talents. Imagine yourself as the Indonesian government, where there are private teams, right? They will exchange nationalities to succeed to that private team just because they have more talented and they don't have enough resources because the government is not paying attention to them, which is actually bad because as the local government, that's what you actually want. Besides that, we also need to remember how profitable the sport industry actually is. With the merch sales, the sponsor tickets, and things like that, the merch, the sponsor, and the tickets, when this is implemented in the local government, the revenue comes full circle. If the team is actually succeeds to gain a high profit, this increases when the profit increases, this goes full circle, right? They can hire better coaches, better teams, and better infrastructures to help them to nurture their talents. And this means that not only diehard fans of that specific group or that specific local, the local government, the local team would be recognized internationally if they were to be successful, and the local area itself they will feel support from the nationality itself. For example, in Indonesia, this opens doors for kids in Indonesia who were, I used to know that being a sports doesn't actually value things like that. And now they feel supported. They see one of their local team players who is actually playing for international round and things like that. So it opens doors for a lot of people. And for those reasons why I'm proud to propose. Thank you so much.
Test. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think Sanya told you many things. Firstly, about how the mechanizations of the particular benefit coming from as to how if it's privately owned, and also how like B, if it is based on the identity, because Sanya told you as well, if how the counterfactual of government, because it is something that's based on identity, because that's how the governments are going to credit themselves. For example, just like putting the names of Jakarta instead of the football club, for example, that's going to happen. That's the reasons why like it is so harmful within the government side. Therefore, the way, but let's engage with the opening oppositions. I think that the way that we frame OO, firstly, I think OO never explained about why a private entity is likely to incentivize to make this particular corporate, to make this kind of football club. I think they don't really explain on like, as to how like they are really incentivized. Because look, indeed, yes, that all football clubs, for example, or like every football clubs are going to be privately owned, but it is remain a question of whether or not they want to make it. We think it's based on the idea of incentivize of whether or not it can make you profitable, more companies and whatnot. And I think it is something that's we think that's something that is done by Sanya, because she told you like that because it is sport tournament is something that is hugely profitable in a way that there are always being a huge seats coming from your stadiums is so much full. That's the reasons why like there are too much kind of prizes coming if you win the competition and whatnot. But also be like also how like even like your father, and also how there are many stakeholders in your life, including your parents and whatnot. They're going to incentivize you. For example, like you're going to be brought into a football kind of tournament, even like from your little age, like 4 or 5 years old, in a way that they want to make to internalize this kind of identity within you. Therefore, like firstly, I think I also never explained you why the comparative then sport being politicized is something that's really harmful. This is the way that we really distinct ourselves from OO. The harms we portray is so much significant because we told you how at the end of the day it is something that is based on identity. Told you that if sport is based, even like in status quo right now, that sport is something that is based on identity, that's the reasons why people are so much being violent in a way that they feel if they are losing, for example, just like in Kalimantan, if you're losing because of the percentage are losing again like West Java or whatever, then they're going to feel that their identity is hurted. This is the same kind of implementation as to how like people are so much hurted because they feel that religion is their identity, but now that it is football becomes identity inside of the government, therefore like they feel so much hurted at the moment like the football sport teams are losing because their representativeness are not working. But also this also count on the idea of how the development of this particular people or like the particular sport team is not even maximum, given the fact that it's going to be driven by the politics as to how that it is something that can make you to be more having election winning and whatnot, right? But B, I think that meaning the benefits of OO cannot really fly. But then again, CO say like we're going to have lower barrier to enter the sport teams because it is something that is based on the meritocracy, but also how that based on the meritocracy it means that you're going to be proportionally feedback between within the particular systems, but also how that sport in nature is profitable in and on itself. That's why that we think that we frame of OO. But then again, let's compare. But let's engage with the government team as a whole. I think that there is no clear distinction between both. That's the reason why I'm going to engage with both. But firstly, let's talk with OG. I think that opening government is so much assumptive as to how that they think government are going to develop these particular sport teams to be more efficient and also like to be more profitable. But at the same time, I think that the issues of local government is that firstly there are a lot of mismanagement of local issues, and also like B, of course, like the ideas of infrastructure issues as well. But firstly, if we engage with the idea of exploitation that pushed by the government team because they assume that profit incentivized is equal to worsening conditions of athletes, for example, response is firstly, what kind of exploitation that they mean? Because I think if the exploitation that they mean is something that is forcing the athlete to be working harder, I think that's the nature of sport, right? Because that's the same way as we are debating right now, where you just because it is something that is competitive, therefore you have no choice but to be more competitive and also working harder. And I think that's the kind of push that likely to be given by the corporate, the same as the government. But I think that that's the reason why like the harm that they've been pushed is not even happening right now. But personally, But B, assuming yes, it benefits the owner of corporation only, for example. But at the end, right, if that kind of particular push coming from the corporation, I think it also comes with the amounts of more funding and whatnot. Well, at the end, it benefits the athlete too because they are having more capital to develop themselves. But B, I think like the ideas of as well too that we're going to ignore the potential percent. If affirmative really care about giving the best for local area, then they need to vote for the oppositions. Why then? Firstly, we told you that we're going to lose barrier because of the pragmatism within the corporation itself. Because they want to win. They also win because they wanted to have the particular price coming from the corporation and whatnot, right? Which therefore it should have been meritocracy based. Therefore, insofar you are the best, for example, to have to join into a particular tournament, then you're going to be infused in no matter what kind of identity you have, no matter what kind of thing that you have. Insofar you can prove that you are capable and that you can prove that you are the best within the particular selection, then of course you can be included. Therefore, we think if we base on the meritocracy based instead of the opposition, for example, we think it is fairer. Because what? Because sport team is something that should have been based on the idea of how much you put an effort into the sport team. Well, at the same time, if it is an affirmative, because you necessarily based on the identity, because that's what the local government incentive is, therefore it's not something that is fair, given the fact that your birth lottery or like what kind of identity that you have, especially like you're coming from West Java, for example, it's not something that you can choose. It's not something that you can try to. It's not something that you can modify. But in opposition, that's the reasons why that we are going to give them a mutual feedback as to what kind of effort that they've already poured into that particular thing as well, right? But talking about the losing sense of belonging instead of the opposition, that sense of belonging instead of affirmative never exists in the very first place because the struggle of the athletes outweigh the particular identity. This looks like how if you are coming from a debating community such as in Central Java, like you were not being supported by your EDS or like by your seniors and whatnot. That therefore, like if at the moment you are joining into a competition in national and you feel that there's so much burden and whatnot, and you don't feel that kind of thing because you have so much thing to bear on, right? Therefore, that we think that's why that all those things are never be enough to be talking about. But I think they talk to the harms of now competition holders detrimental for sport as to how it's giving to the inspector and whatnot. But look, I think firstly, if that the companies are going to give their ownership into the another actor, I think I think that it is a way for a betterment for the sport team, because given the fact that the initial company does not even feel that it is profitable enough, that's why they need to give that, and that's the reasons why it is more rational. Therefore, we're so proud to oppose.